this morning, especially those of you who are here for the first time. This is the First Unitarian Church of Salt Lake City. I'm Steve Glaser. I'm a member here. During the summer, we do something a little different. We have our summer forum. We have speakers on various topics, unlike the rest of the year where we have a formal service. This is our 5th forum of the year, and Doctors Patrick Belmont and Paul Rogers are speaking here regarding fire here in Utah in a warming climate. I'm going to be introducing them more formally shortly. But first, Henry Whiteside is going to light our chalice.
Good morning. Good morning. Fire and ice. Some say the world will end in fire. Others say in ice. From what I've tasted of desire, I hold with those that favor fire. But if it had to perish twice, I know enough of hate to say that that is also heavy and would suffice. Robert Frost, of course, 1923, before it was humanly possible to destroy the world both with fire and with ice. I guess you've got I blew my big roll. Speaking of fire, this is an amazing device. You see the electric arc? This is not your backyard garden.
So we have 2 speakers today. Patrick Belmont is a professor of the Department of Watershed Sciences at Utah State University, and his research program spans hydrology, geomorphology, and climate science, with recent projects focusing on wildfire impacts on fish and water resources, climate change implications for multi-use management of public lands, and climate change risks and adaptation strategies for ski resorts in Utah. Paul Rogers, first of all, he's a fellow Unitarian. He's a member of our Cache Valley Fellowship. And we've actually worked together a little bit on things, particularly regarding the Great Salt Lake. But he also holds degrees in geography from Utah State and the University of Wisconsin. His doctorate is from USU in ecology. His prime area of study has been on human impacts on vegetation in the western US. His ecosystem monitoring research has taken him around the world, 5 different continents. He's an adjunct professor in the Department of Environment and Society, a USU Ecology Center associate, and the director of the Western Aspen Alliance. He's published more than 50 professional and technical papers and appeared in media, print, video, TV, and online content more than 100 times. He has taught environmental problem solving, natural resource monitoring, introduction to environmental science, and Planet Earth for honor students, as well as co-organized and spoken at more than 40 professional workshops. So let's give them a big round of applause. So they are going to each speak on this, and then after that, we're going to pass the plate and have some announcements, and after that, we'll have some Q&A.
You mind if I use the mobile? Thanks for having us here. I will attempt to navigate the technology, but I think the last time I walked through those doors was in 1987. So I lived here briefly in Salt Lake. And it's been quite a while since I've been here. This is a fun and welcoming community, so I appreciate the invitation. As Steve said, we're going to be talking about fire and climate, but mostly in the context of Utah, and particularly at the sort of interface area. I call it wildland development interface because many of these areas are not quote unquote urban. They're in these ex-urban areas such as resorts or cabins out in the woods, or right now, Monroe Mountain. I don't know if many people know, but there's at least 250 homes on top of Monroe Mountain. So these, just the ownership divisions within and among our national forests and other federal lands can be really problematic. And we won't go into great detail on that, but it's really difficult to manage forest without fires on Monroe Mountain and a lot of other places. That's an exceptional example, but we're going to see a lot of damage and potentially people injured, hopefully not, when we start introducing or reintroducing fire to these areas. So that's just a little bit of a backdrop. We're going to explore this at a general level, but our MO was to leave a lot of time for discussion, either in here or individually out in the reception hall afterwards. So let me see. I just wanted to ground it a little bit in UUism, if that's a word. But this is sort of where we're touching base with these 7 principles of Unitarian Universalism. Just open and responsible search for information. Patrick and I are still searching for a lot. We're not coming here with all the answers. We're going to give you a framework, so to speak. And that's the whole point here, is we're all learning together. And then more directly, this interdependent web of life. And it goes quite a ways, from water to soils to plants to animals, and definitely to human interactions with those systems. So just a little bit of grounding there. I'm going to read briefly from a chapter that in this book that I hope you are aware of. This book is important. It came out in 2024 for many of the big issues in the American West. There's at least 3 or 4 chapters on watersheds and water environments in the Great Salt Lake, some of them by people here in Salt Lake City, cultural issues, development issues, all kinds of the big issues in the Western US. So I encourage you to get a copy of that if you're interested in those things. And the thing that I liked most about it is that they were all place-based and had to involve some narrative. So they're not just technical speak in science, but they're for general audiences. This chapter is called At Home with Forest Fires in the West, and that'll be one of our themes, sort of, is these are natural things. You hear that a lot, but our news media is terrible at reporting on forest fires. Just one excerpt from that. Messaging is key to living with fire. The dominant narratives of popular media and government agencies are overwhelmingly negative. Cataclysmic storylines about modern, in quotes, mega fires lead to mistaken impressions that human building and agricultural forestry are not culpable. Moreover, it's negligent to claim that fires have not been a historical fact of Western life. Past climatic periods spawned more widespread conflagrations, while select native burning was common. In our haste to lay blame to modern conflagrations, a cabal of managers, media, and some scientists have invoked increasing drought. However, what's really new here is the growing number of structures, and sometimes lives in the path of predictable flames. Rather than curtail forest sprawl directly, a woe is me stance emerges. Something bad is happening to us. In newspeak, the resultant language is, all these are in quotes, devastation, destruction, loss, charred, tragedy, and so on. Rather than inflammatory language, we should kindle conversations based on ecological opportunity and social connection with wildlands. Policy strategies grounded in complexity, preparedness, acceptance of the unpredictable will be crucial. Climate change and its evolving linkages to Western fire are daunting, but framing these challenges as frightening enemies too large to overcome discourages constructive engagement. Positioning ourselves in an adaptive stance involves learning while doing and nimble responses based on documented expertise or experience. So that's just a little bit of sort of a backdrop to this, and we just don't get those stories if we're, the lay public in terms of our understanding of wildfires in natural settings. And by the way, that we're primarily talking about natural settings here. We're not really talking about urban fires and fire departments and so on. We're talking about primarily forests, but wildlands in general. I don't know if most of you are aware, but the greater acreage of fires in the United States is not in forests, but it's in other types of vegetation. If you think of southern Idaho, that Snake River Plain and the cheatgrass and sagebrush and so on. So there's actually greater acreage in a typical year than there is in forests, but forests it's exciting, it's attention grabbing. It's like, I call it nature's headline. All you got to do is show the pictures of a forest fire and it gets your attention. So with that in mind, I've already started to contrast this popular view versus an ecological view. The top one that happens to be from Alaska, where it's just devastation and destruction. It's all about us, the human beings, and our structures and our vehicles, and hopefully not our lives, but sometimes firefighters or even citizens, such as in LA, get caught in the path of these things. But we're I think, advocating a more measured, sober look and trying to understand these intricate ecological connections. And to do that, we need to do a little background research. It doesn't have to be detailed, but this interconnected web of life that is part of UUism is also part of our sort of learning and understanding. And it should be part of the general public's, and we all need to do a better job of that as part of why we're here today. So, if this looks complex to you, it should. There are many different vegetation types at different elevation levels, and they burn in vastly different ways, right? And I've just put on some of the major cities in the West. This is a graphic from this book chapter. So you should be aware, for example, that pinyon juniper burns much more frequently than the spruce fir forest up at higher elevation, and so on. So when you hear those generalizations, such as we've eliminated fire for 100 years and the forests are all messed up, what is 100 years in the context of 450? It's not a lot. I would submit that we've only been effective at firefighting since we started jumping out of planes in about 1947 or 48. And even that was incremental. So it's a drop in the bucket. I don't think we've changed forests that much, but we have changed forests more at lower elevations than middle and upper elevations. We present this a couple times here in different ways, but
I just want to mention real briefly what the fire on the previous slide. Just what the fire cycles are there.
Sorry, yeah, I was thinking that was intuitive. Yeah, so here we go with the sage steppe high desert. This is the return, how often the second fire comes to the same place. So thanks, Patrick. So between 5 and 250, that's a huge span. But you'll hear these platitudes all the time. That should burn every 5 years. Well, that's too generalized. And so on, up the scale, so to speak, up to 450 years or even longer for some less common vegetation types. So this is just an example. We'll show this in a couple different ways. For the United States in general, there's a huge amount of fires. It could be fires the size of this room, or they could be fires the size of a county. They're vastly different. Only so many of them are in large wildfires. I did the math real kind of quick a couple days ago. It was something like 1 or 2% of the fires that burn that turn into what we call large fires. I think that's beyond a bit more than 100 acres or 1,000 acres, but you get the point. So a lot of fires, very few of them but we only see what's on our TV, that big sensational stuff, and usually some people in distress. I'm going to pass the baton over to Patrick here.
So fire gets a bad rap, and there's a lot of reasons for that. Of course, a lot of our personal interactions with fire are breathing this, smoke that we don't want to be breathing, seeing people's homes burn down, things like that. But fire, as Paul pointed out, is a very natural part of these forest regimes in the western U.S. And it actually does a lot of good as well. So, fish don't ask for much, right? They need cool water, they need places to hide, they need some pools, basically, so they can go hide in those during drought times, things like that, and a little bit of food. And what we've seen in a lot of places across the western U.S. is when you don't have fire, the hill slopes don't get rejuvenated, the streams don't get rejuvenated, and the habitat for the fish actually gets degraded. These incredible messes that fires make afterwards, all the erosion and all the gravel and sand that comes down after them, it looks like a mess. And some of us may be inclined to say, we got to get in there and clean that up. But this is the thing. Ecology loves messes. Fish need those messes for all this habitat that they need. So, wrong way. Here's just an example of, you can get the sense, this is a stream channel here, and it is just chock full with ash after a fire. And so you can imagine being a fish in there, that's not a great place to be. And so, you also go around after fires and you'll see lots of fish that have died. But here's the thing, again, it's not the fire's fault and it's not the fish's fault. The reason that we have a lot of fish kills after fire in conditions like this is because now we've prevented fish from migrating elsewhere during these conditions and then migrating back a couple of years later to this beautiful mess that the fires left behind. We've put in all of these diversion dams and dam structures and things like that. So we've really prevented fish from doing what they've done for millions and millions of years to adapt to living with fire. This is just to give you a sense. This is the Weber River watershed, and the detail is not important, but you can see lots and lots of dots. There's hundreds of dots on here. And these are all impoundments, little diversion dams, things like that we put into the Weber watershed. So you can imagine the fish here, they just don't stand a chance. They can't go downstream, go elsewhere, and come back. So this is another problem. And this is a photo of one of these little diversion dams. So imagine thousands of those throughout our stream networks here. But wildfires are probably responsible for the best fish habitat in the western U.S. You probably maybe had not thought of that before you came here today, but leaving here, I'd like that to be one association you have with fire. Anybody been down to the Tusher Mountains, down kind of south central Utah? Beautiful part of the world. They're a very, very old volcano. And this is part of the Tushers. They burned during the Twitchell Canyon fire over 10 years ago. And a lot of this sediment came down through Clear Creek, so-called. It wasn't clear for the next year or two, but it cleared back up again. But what the fire left behind were all of these beautiful boulders. And some of these had been here from previous fires, but they all came down in fires. That's the main point related to fish that I want you to take away from this is, this is all this beautiful mess that really make Utah such a great place for fish. It's all due to fire. This is the Dollar Ridge fire. This is Strawberry River down near Duchesne. And, what a mess, right? What a mess. This used to be a beautiful little single-threaded river meandering through a grassy floodplain. Well, the Dollar Ridge fire had some other things to say about that. Now you've got different threads of the river, little side channels, which are great for some of the smaller fish to go take refuge in some of those really small side channels. So, over and over again, part of what humans have done is to simplify things, to simplify ecosystems. And a lot of the organisms that live there, that doesn't work well for them. It works well for us, want to put in pipes, want to put in sidewalks, things like that. There are benefits to it, but we've got to be thinking about what are we losing in these cases. And often simplifying things doesn't work well for the ecology. Let me hand it back over to Paul and talk a bit more about the longer term fire.
Yeah, thanks. Just a quickie slide here on 1,000 years in less than a minute. But those benefits where we modify things, what Patrick was just talking about, they tend to work even for us really well in the short term, but we're not really great long-term thinkers. So when we straighten rivers and when we clear out extra species we don't like in a forest and so on, it's like, yeah, this is going great, but we're not thinking of the 7 generations ahead, and they tend to backfire on us. It reminds me of some work I've done in Czechia, where they say, and maybe our friend from Ireland is familiar with this, but 95% of the river miles have been straightened in the whole country, or channelized. And so that probably were great for a few hundred years, but now they're facing a lot of those consequences. So back on target here, I don't know if you can see that shading, but this is sort of 1,000 years from the year 2000 backwards. So this is roughly 1,000 years ago looking forward. And this is a Palmer Drought Severity Index. All you really need to know is the blue line is kind of the average. Above the blue line and the dotted are annual records, and the red line is a 20-year average. I just want to point out that this, what's known as a medieval warm period, roughly 1200 to 1450, I guess, a warmer period where there were extensive 50, 75-year droughts. And this is data from northern Utah, by the way. So it's our area. Where the line is below there is droughty times, where it's above is wetter times. The other thing is little ice age. It's more wet and cool in that period, about 150, 200 years. But this is the year 1900, and this is the wettest period here in at least 1,000 years, if not 2,000. So, and incidentally, that's when we developed a lot of our forestry practices, a lot of our water use practices in this part of the world. Was probably in a very unusual time. So when you develop policy, you want to kind of develop them at least with average data in mind to the extent you can, not extraordinary data one way or the other. But the 20th century, the wettest century in terms of influencing forest fires in at least 1,000 up to 2,000 years. So that really influences our quote unquote success in putting out fires. The other way to look at this is we've become a little complacent. We think we're pretty good at putting out fires. And now clearly in the last 10, 15, 20 years, we are transitioning to a droutier time, right? I don't even need to invoke climate warming yet. It's transitioned from wet to dry. And so we would expect just with that information alone to have more fires and larger fires with sort of a buildup of fuels here and an availability of fuels moving into a droutier time. Clearly there's an influence of a warming climate, but with just the basic past climate in mind, we should be aware that that affects in a strong way how our forests burn. Let's pass this back and forth here. Yeah. Now we're going to get to the rapid juggling part of our show.
Paul and I have never done a talk together, so I'm just delighted to be doing this with him. But you have probably seen in the news this notion that we have unprecedented wildfire, right? Anytime the news has been talking about that, they like to use the word unprecedented. Probably gets a lot of clicks. And that is true if you only look back to 1984. Right? So, which a news cycle is only like 8 minutes long, so that's a long time, I grant you. But these are the data here. So this is the number of acres burned, and there's a lot of variability from year to year. This is for the entire western U.S. And if you just look back to 1984, it has gone up, and it's gone up quite a bit on average, with a lot of variability. The reason they often only look back to 1984 is because that's when we had the satellite imagery that we could map every single fire at very high resolution. But Forest Service has been collecting data for a long time. And this is what the rest of that data looks like going back to about 1915. We had a long period where there was very little fire, a lot of suppression, and it was a little bit wetter time period. And then if you look back to the early 1900s, though, you're looking at similar numbers to what we are now. There's nothing unprecedented about it. But wait, there's more. This is that same data set that I was just showing you. all down here, going back from now until about 1915. This is the natural background fire occurrence. Those numbers that I had Paul go back to, is saying about on average, how frequently do these like to burn? If you take the average of those, this is how much fire we should naturally have in the landscape in the Western US. We're nowhere close. We live in a very flammable landscape, And so, there is no fireless future, right? We have to face that. But, as humans, we're incredibly capable. We have this kind of command and control, or we have had historically this command and control idea of nature. So this is that same red line that I was showing you before, where 1950s, it was pretty high, went low for a long time, then it went high again. This blue line is when we built all of our reservoirs. That's our reservoir storage capacity throughout the entire Western US. So part of what happened is, we started to put out fires a lot more effectively. We said, okay, this is great, no more fires. Let's start building big reservoirs. So, here's Hoover Dam closing right here. Bear Lake is probably somewhere in here. And we built thousands of reservoirs throughout the Western US, thinking that they're not going to fill right back in with sediment because we got this fire thing under control. Hasn't worked out that well lately, actually. And this ends up being really expensive. In some of the reservoirs that have filled recently, the city of Denver spent $30 million just digging out one of their reservoirs. California, near LA, they spent $150 million digging out 2 of their reservoirs. So this is a very high risk thing right now. We've built all these reservoirs, and we're coming to a point where we can't control fire like we thought we could.
So knocking on the door a little bit of climate part. This is a kind of a gross generalization, but I want to kind of put things in this framework. We're pretty good at modeling. Now we're looking at the future climates in terms of temperature, right? We feel a pretty high level of confidence. Thousands of scientists coming from many different angles around the world, pretty much in agreement on that. And then this is a projection of it on our continental US. And we feel pretty good about that. We feel a lot less confident about the precipitation part of that, but still we can predict some general trends. I just want to put that in context.
And we feel good about our ability to predict it. We don't feel good about the results.
Thank you. Exactly, yeah. This is great. So we expect warming and drying to happen. That's no great revelation, right? A little more confidence in the warming, a little less, particularly right around northern Utah. There's more that we feel a lot stronger here going to the southwest and California and so on, but there's quite a bit of variability in how that might play out. And then we throw in all this elevational complexity and so on. At any rate, warming and drying, we feel pretty good. We can project that in terms of vegetation. I happen to have this at my fingertips because I do a lot of work with quaking aspen ecology. This is what they call a classic climate envelope model. You take the vegetation where it is today, you try to understand the habitat, what it needs in terms of moisture and other factors, and you project it into the future. So this was about 2010, 2030, 2090. It's this kind of disaster show where the habitat for quaking aspen, which has all kinds of intricate relationships to fire, and I have some handouts on that if you're interested in that. And you project it into the future. It's a very sort of simplistic approach, and there's other factors that affect that. But I just want to give people the idea that habitats, places where fire-prone or less fire-prone forests can grow, are also changing. So it's not just the warming and drying, but it's the shifting of habitats. And all the plants and animals and water relationships and soil relationships that go along with it. Holy cow, this is getting quite complex, right? We don't want to drown ourselves in complexity. Just know that these things are shifting and different ways, both positive and negative. This is Utah. It's essentially the same diagram, or same information we showed earlier for the continental US. And the number of fires with the number of fires that are over in the total fires in the lighter colored dots, and the number of fires that are over 100 acres in the blue dots. So something like less than 1/10 for sure. I wanted to bring this to your attention, and I encourage you to visit this website, Utah Fire Info, because this dot here is what? Where we are, right where we're sitting right now. So this is the UU Church. You can see warmer colors are more fire prone. It's a pretty simple map. You notice this abrupt boundary. Most of our valleys where we water like heck are not very flammable at all. So, by the way, our wildland urban interface, a technical definition, will have anything within a mile and a half of that as being in the flammable zone. So they're a little bit off in that way. However, as soon as we get into the forests, we have this sort of chaparral, oaks and maples here, pretty fire prone. You can even see north and south facing slopes, the north facing slopes being redder and thicker conifers and so on. We have this variability, but you can look this up for where you live and put your own dot on the map, so to speak, and get some sense in a general way of the flammability where you live. We're going to expect more fires with a warming climate, larger fires, and feedback loops that are both positive and negative. Patrick pointed out the hydrological feedback loops, a lot of positives for quaking aspen that I work in. But of course, where we have all these human structures and human interventions, they could be viewed as negatives if we're not smart enough to have the foresight to do this a little bit better. So some general messages, we're winding down towards some takeaways here. We need extensively more education about fire and its effects and how we interact with that. This is just simply about living better with our planet. And these things when you see the headlines and you see the disasters, such as in California, the most fire-prone state by far in the country, with homes throughout the Sierra Nevada mountains that are very fire-prone, we commonly accept this phrase, we don't build in a floodplain, but we do not accept the fire corollary to that. The third one down, we haven't begun to think this way. And this interacts quite a bit with our hyper-capitalistic zeitgeist. We want to build wherever we want, and we're all going to have the house at the end of the road, right? It's a huge fallacy, but we operate probably in this country more so than almost anywhere in the world. We deserve this. We can build wherever we want. If that was next to a flood-prone river, we would have some laws and hopefully some planning and zoning against that, but we're not there yet with fire, and I'm advocating for us having that in the future. Accepting fire, one of the main things is some humility. We're not really good at that either in America, right? And we don't live apart from nature as much as we'd like to think so. Obviously, cutting our carbon use. So a lot of these discussions, we need to think about the long term and the short term. What can we do now? And how can we sort of cut off this carbon addiction that we have? And then supporting science. And we are in a serious battle against evidence-based discussions. I know this environment is not, but this is really serious. You're having folks say, I'm going to make judgments shooting from the hip and based on my emotions, and let's forget this expert over here and these other people that have been studying these things their whole lives. Obviously, you know this, but it's a major caution here. I just want to put that forward, this idea that we would be more active where we have development and less so at a distance. This happens to be from the Pando aspen clone, and some prescribed burning we did there experimentally. This is a general model. We haven't done that yet. We still run after almost every fire, even when they're doing a lot of good. I'm going to pass it one more time back to Patrick.
Wonderful. We'll close with a reading from the book of the Salt Lake Tribune. This is an op-ed that I wrote right in the wake of the LA fires. The LA fires The total cost on that is looking something on the order of $250 billion. Billion dollars. Well, that's a big number. And there are so many things that you can't put a dollar value on that were lost, undoubtedly. So I wrote an op-ed that was just trying to get Utah to think about, what does this mean for us? And I'll just read a little bit of this here. For Utahns, the devastation of the LA fires should be a sobering reminder that we too live in a fire-prone landscape and must do more to prepare for inevitable fires of the future. For decades, we in the West have operated under the delusion that we can prevent all wildfires. That strategy has backfired. There's a hard truth we need to face. There is no fire-free future in Utah. Wisdom involves making hard choices and exercising restraint. A wiser future in the fire-prone Western U.S. means restricting development in risky areas, reducing overall energy consumption, and eliminating fossil fuels as quickly as feasible, and empowering the institutions that manage and regulate our forests and communities. Failure remains an option. It's the one we are stubbornly choosing now. But if we seize the opportunity, Utah could emerge as a leader in wildfire resilience. In the end, it's not the land or the nature of fire that must change, it is us. So with that, we'd love to open it up to questions, comments. Thank you.
We're going to go to Q&A now. When we get to that, please speak only into the microphone because we have people who need hearing assistance, and that only works when you're using a microphone. Also, people who are online, and they can only hear in that case. So I am going to call on people. Lee Schuster is going to bring a mic around to you, and we'll go from there. But one person got in the queue first, and that's Kara, so she will be first.
Use teacher voice and shout. So I didn't know where Monroe was, but I looked up and I thought, oh, Monroe's down near Fish Lake, and one of you is that quaking aspen expert. And Fish Lake, isn't that where the giant interrelated aspen, the panda world is? And I wondered if that fire is in that very unusual aspen area.
There's just some headlines in the paper yesterday, day before, saying it was threatened, and it was funny because I must have been on Facebook. A lot of people were refuting that, but I don't think it's very threatened, and that's a loaded term. It's across Highway 24. Monroe Mountain is probably 10 air miles away from that, but it's burning in that direction. I just want to put this in context. In fact, 9,000 years of context. We did a pedoanthropology study there where we looked at ancient charcoals, and we found very little fire in the Pando clone for 9,000 years. So it's not often affected by fire. The other part is, if some of it did burn, in the unlikely case that it did, it would not be a bad thing, as we've been trying to point out here, that it wouldn't threaten the clone. In fact, it would reinvigorate it. Its threats are some other things. There are things with flat teeth that do a lot of munching. Some of those are domestic, and some of those are so-called wild species. That's probably a better short answer. The Pando talk is a whole nother one. I'll come back from another time. That's been one of my main areas of research and occasionally appearing in the media. Over.
Hi, my name is Ross Chambliss. Thank you both for your talk. It's been really interesting. My question really is about, the homeowners insurance industry is really in crisis now because of wildfires. A lot of big insurance companies have pulled completely out of California and other places, and even people living in homes here in this state are increasingly at risk of losing their insurance because of where they live and the risk of fires. I guess my question really is about how do you see potentially as as the insurance industry needs to adapt or take on better practices to incentivize the way homes are built or how people living in these high-risk areas are going to be living there, if there may be ways to better incorporate some of the better practices that are, better for ecosystems in the ways that you were describing, as far as learning to encourage, better, what am I trying to say? Ecosystem practices, or, if people are going to live in these areas, maybe there's ways that we can kind of find that balance of, for humans and for what's good for the forest. So just curious if you've had any thoughts on that.
I'll take that. Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you, Ross. And this is something I've been thinking a lot about lately. One of the board members from Allianz Insurance, which is one of the largest insurance companies in the world, just made a very bold statement. And it wasn't specific to fire. It was more broadly about climate change in general. But fire is certainly a part of the risks that they're seeing and are very concerned about. And his statement basically said that climate change will undermine capitalism as we know it. It will eat itself for lunch. Because they're seeing all these risks related to fire, but then they're also seeing all these risks related to sea level rise and storm surge and hurricanes and so many of these risks that climate change amplifies. And so he said, on our current trajectory, capitalism will not persist much longer. These risks will eat it up. You can't transfer the risk, because so many assets will become uninsurable. All of Miami will be uninsurable because they're going to be underwater. This is just physics. It's not my opinion. It's just physics, right? There are so many places that we have built into very wildfire-prone areas that will be unprotectable. The insurance industry should have been a lot more vocal about this over the last 3 or 4 decades. The science has been very clear for that period of time. They're getting to a point now where they're saying, we thought something else was going to come through. We thought there was going to be some kind of silver bullet. And they're recognizing that's not the case. My hope is that we don't shift to a place where insurance companies just flat out cannot cover risks too quickly. $250 billion for the LA fires. We're all paying the price of that. Was there anybody here whose insurance didn't go up this year? Mine certainly did. And I don't live anywhere near a fire-prone area. So they're very quickly coming awake to this. This stands certainly in contrast to what a lot of our federal government is saying right now. That doesn't matter. Those are just words. The physics is going to win out in the end. So I do see a lot of people in the insurance industry who are starting to change the way that they're talking about these risks and change the way that they're talking about the implications for how we develop and things like that. But there's still a lot of people who are living in a fantasy land, frankly. And it's very concerning to me because we're seeing people just lose coverage. And there are people in California, there are people here in Utah who have their insurance companies gotten to the end of the year and they said, we're not going to renew you. We're actually not going to offer insurance in this area anymore. And that's not fair. It's not a healthy way to deal with it. But my concern is that there's more and more that are going to go down that route.
I would just add to that briefly. The chapter I wrote is as a place-based, as I said. It's about Island Park. We're getting into this zone of the haves and the have-nots as well in the interim before we get to the hardcore physics. And the haves, such as in Sun Valley, Idaho, their insurance companies have started to hire their own firefighting forces. In Island Park, I purposely picked a place that was a middle-class getaway, right? And it's just everyone for themselves. And it's a hugely fire-prone landscape that will just completely toast. It's in lodgepole pine. And they're doing bits and pieces, but it's everyone on their own, and the insurance companies, they're not going to be able to keep up with that. So if you have more, we're getting into this more sort of skewed relationship with our environment, and one aspect of that is hyper-capitalism, pro-growth, and the wealthy are going to do okay, right? For a while until we run into the real cliff of the physics. So just a little addition to what Patrick said.
Hi, I'm Lisa Mountain. I know Patrick through Youth Coalition for Great Salt Lake. Thank you both for being here. I'm going to ask the question that I bet a lot of us are wondering, which I don't know what your answer will be, but is my house going to burn down? And here, we live in, 1500 East, 1500 South area. And, especially after the LA fires, I mean, it's always been a concern in recent years, but especially after that. And then reading, some articles in the Tribune about insurance and that everyone who's east of 1300 East should be concerned that they're going to be dropped from their insurance. And so this has actually been a little reassuring today, because it sounds like where we are is not such a fire-prone area, but it's still very concerning. And I know you can't give us a definitive answer, but just love to hear what you have to say. Should we move further west, or in this? Well, then I know, right? So anyway, I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that. Thank you.
Yeah, basically, again, this is, knowing the ecology and the physics, but if there's a lot of moisture in a landscape, this is really intuitive, such as watering your lawn, such as imported hardwood trees, such as paved roads and things. You're going to be less flammable, as this diagram shows in the upper right. The more you get into a forested environment or a natural environment, it could be sagebrush and what's called flashy fires, if people are familiar with cheatgrass. You're much more at risk. So where are you on that continuum? And this is only probability. We can't guarantee you that, as you suggested, but you have a better chance. Ultimately, with many natural resource issues, it is not a bad thing to figure out in this country how to live in a more concentrated way. And I know we've given that a bad name, but living out in these areas comes with inherent risk.
Yeah, and I'll just add briefly to that we can't give you a definitive answer for your house. What I can give you a definitive answer is that you will be paying for other damages. There will be lots of other, places that have been built in places that are just very fire prone, and we're all going to be paying for that up to some point. And that's concerning. That's why we all should be playing a role in advocating for just doing this smarter. We know what needs to be done. This is not a matter of the science being questionable. We know it needs to be done.
Morning, Richard Lane. Two-part question. Senator Curtis, this week on PBS, did an interview, and he and a Democrat are working on legislation. So do you think that's going to have any effect? And the second part is, how the heck do we get the attention of, seems like many politicians are kissing the ring, worried about their political life, but you hear $250 billion for the LA fire? It would seem like the economics would get their attention. How do we get the message across?
I guess it would be the same for climate issues in general. I know Senator Curtis has an interest in that. I don't want to go too far down the political lane. We're trying to confine this. We can talk a little afterwards if you want. But yeah, those big price tags are not ringing the bell when we continue to sell land, and the developers with big eyes and big dollar signs and are saying, you're going to have the coolest place, we're going to have a subdivision in this, we don't say this part, the very fire-prone landscape. But it looks beautiful today. We should all expect it to burn tomorrow or the next tomorrow. So that didn't answer your question thoroughly. It's a complex question, but that's what I got.
Yeah, let me take a little different tack. I haven't seen that legislation, but I'm pretty sure it won't make a difference. And here's why. And more broadly, this is a very sobering thought. Politics as we practice it in America right now cannot solve the major problems that we have. Because it is all about how to help certain people make money. It is all about short-term decisions. It's not about long-term planning. It used to be, but it's not anymore. It's all short-term. And so anything that we're doing at the state level or at the federal level, it's all with short-term ideas in mind. We really have to get back to a place where we can look long-term and start making some of the hard changes that need to be done. And part of that has to be, it can't be all about growth and making money. If it's about growth and making money, we're going to find ways to cut corners. We're going to find the places to build that you can just make a lot of money in right now and have somebody else pay the cost down the road. So really, that's what I keep coming back around to is our politics is fundamentally broken. And it has to be about rebuilding relationships and getting away from this growth obsession.
Yeah, I should just say, and I want to get these other questions. Thinning the forest is not going to do it. Does anybody remember the first Trump term when he talked about sweeping the forest out like they do? I could go off on this harangue a long time, but we adopted European agricultural forestry, and it's been, can you say shit show in here? It's been a shit show since. Really, but thinning the forest, mechanically treating it is not unlike the diversion dams and these other things we keep going back to. We're going to, mansplain our way out of this thing, and that's not the right angle. It's learning to live within these environments.
All right, I have a question up here.
I live in Layton in a little place called Rolling Hills Estates, right next to Hill Air Force Base. But right east of the fence line of Rolling Hills Estates is this vast, dry, vacant field. And it kind of comes around and goes almost towards Hillfield Road. Do I need to watch that closely if that field gets set on fire? How catastrophic would that be?
Well, again, a complex question. I don't know exactly what you're talking about, but it sounds like it's mostly not forest and it's other types of vegetation. So typically you can equate the flame length with the size as a product of the size of the vegetation. So if the vegetation is a half a meter tall, about 2 or 3 times that would be the flame length. If you think about a mature tree, it could be 30 meters tall, the flame lengths. So, and the other thing, first of all, anybody who lives near a fire-prone landscape should treat their property in a way that makes it safer, and most importantly, have some sort of a safety plan for just getting out. You got to leave sometimes. The other thing that's useful, perhaps, is that fires typically burn away from, they're going to burn toward the dry vegetation, and they're typically going to burn uphill during the day and downhill at night. So these things might be informative to you. So have a plan in mind for safety. If there's a road in between, that's super helpful, especially if you're dealing with smaller, lower vegetation. So you're probably generally safe, but it's something that you want to plan for. And then go to your city council meetings and say, please don't fill in that lot with a bunch of homes.
About a month ago, there was an article in the Trib about the worst place in Utah for fire was in Ivins, Utah, in an upscale subdivision called Kayenta. And it talked about water, drought, and how much the insurance was going out. Now that's brush, not many trees, but how is that desert that's super dry so bad that it gets on the front page of the Trib?
Yeah, I don't know, where is that exactly?
by St. George.
Near St. George. So, yeah, it
Okay.
may be related to just the type of vegetation that's there that may burn very hot. That would be my guess.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's just hot, dry vegetation near a developed area would probably be played largely like this diagram here into their rating system. I'm not familiar with that particular article or location.
And it's very possible they have made the situation worse because, they may have been growing that vegetation, kind of unnaturally.
Yeah.
And so it may be at higher density than it would be naturally.
There's tamarisk in a lot of the canyon areas of Kayenta, which is actually built in a very sensible desert fashion, but this invasive species increases the risk.
All right. I'll go back to Liz here.
So people have mentioned where they live, and you've talked about the potential risk depending on the growth. Is there modeling that shows migration because of the fire risk or the other things that you've been talking about?
Migration?
Are you talking about human migration or?
Yes.
I don't think yet. And our modeling in terms of habitat change as a generality is not nearly there yet. We're starting to think about that and dabble in that, but we're not there to where we can functionally tell people to move over here and there, other than our understanding of how these different environments burn already in the current time.
And that's what I was wondering, if there are projections, but even projections of where people will have to live because of the projections of the fire risk conditions.
Those risk maps exist, and there are certain people who are looking at them before they would choose to buy a house, for example. I don't see a lot of people making decisions based on that right now, but I do see that likely to be the case in moving in the future, not just for wildfire risk, but for flooding risk and lots of other risks. So,
Thanks.
yeah, thank you.
Hi, I'm Bert Lay. We've talked a little bit about our federal elected officials, and I'd like to bring it home to Utah. I used to be optimistic about our legislature becoming more educated on environmental issues, but I'm curious what grade you would give our elected officials in Utah, and specifically the members of the House and Senate Natural Resources, Agriculture, and Environment Committee. And if you don't want to answer, that's fine.
I know either one of us could go off, especially if we had a beer in our hand, for at least an hour on that question. I'm not sure. I think we all know that it's pretty poor. And grabbing these simple solutions is what they're good at. And the solutions often driven by what Patrick keeps going back to is economic decisions. That is just terrible short-term thinking. And so I'm not going to go into detail about it. A lot of that, Curtis purports to be dialed into doing something positive, and he did something positive by not letting it be ultra negative in the big, bad, terrible spending bill on some climate fronts. He held out for a few of those things. I think many of you are aware of that. Let's just say we have a long way to go. It's a pretty poor track record.
Yeah, well, maybe the best answer is that I ran for state legislature twice because of how frustrated I was. So, I came close last time. I got 46% of the vote. I won Logan, but they had gerrymandered in another town that went 80% for the other guy. So, it's very frustrating to see a lot of the short-term thinking and the fact that there are a lot of developers, and not all developers are evil, but there are developers who see opportunities to make a lot of money. And as long as they can get in there, build those homes, sell them, their liability is done. And they have been heavily lobbying the legislature to allow these things to continue because they just need to make that next deal. We got to stop that. We've got to stop that.
Well, maybe the third time will be a charm.
All right. Over here, Lee.
We have a lot of lawyers and developers that are politicians. Why not have a scientist once in a while?
Okay, so this question I don't think has a completely, I'll stand up, solid answer, but it's a question on humans' propensity to hyperbolically discount reward as well as risk, perception of risk. So in the case of wildfire and the cycles that you presented, knock on wood for all of us involved, the cycles, can be 5 years to hundreds of years. And, the standard human lifespan is 80 to 100 years. So with all of the benefits of living in these redder areas and the likelihood or the risk of being impacted by a fire, not being highly perceptible or maybe probable in a certain year, how do you align folks and developers and politicians and citizens and homeowners to think about risk when the rewards of potentially living in these areas may be perceived as more rewarding than the risk that you're assuming?
I'll take this in a very different direction, I'm sure.
Yeah, I'll try to be brief and I'll pass it off to Patrick. But the first thing is that it's probability. So that one that burns it once every 400 years could be next year.
Right.
So the other thing is we're continually presented with this image that this is shocking and it's happening to us. Like, how could they do this to me? I'm not kidding. This is in the way it's presented in our media. When we have the information here in a brief presentation, a lot of this information has been around for decades. But it's not presented to us, and that's why I say education and outreach is so important. We need to let people know that you live in ecosystems that could potentially be dangerous, and the more we push that towards a cliff, the more risky behavior we're getting at, not just as individuals, but as a society. So we're setting ourselves up in that way, but we have the illusion, and a lot of it's presented to us in the way we sell land and we sell property as if this will be here forever. And everybody's had this classic example. Well, Uncle Joe said this was always forested or it never burned here or whatever since he was a kid. Well, the one thing we learn in ecosystem science is this change is much more constant than it's marketed to us.
Yeah, thanks for that, Paul. So I'm writing a book right now, and it's about legacies. It's about the legacies that we leave behind. Not just how we want to be remembered, but the actual things that we leave behind. And of course, climate change is going to be part of that. But there are so many other positive and negative legacies that we leave behind. And one of the questions that I've been grappling with is, how did we allow this whole mess to evolve? How did we get here? Right? Because I don't believe people are evil. And I don't believe that even greed is a sufficient explanation. I mean, the answer that I just gave, that's largely a greed-oriented answer that developers are pursuing just this next deal, even if we know it's not building in the right place. Well, the second chapter of my book is about dopamine. Dopamine is the chemical, the hormone in your brain that is about chasing the next cool thing. It's what drives us to innovate, to chase things, to pursue, African ancestors on the savannah. It's what drove them to go beyond that next ridge, to invent some initial tools. Well, now we're in a world where we're going dopamine crazy. We've got so many different ways that dopamine is taking over our brains. And we're totally, well, for the most part, we don't even realize it. So, part of it is, I think, understanding that the wiring of our brains is not attuned well to the current set of opportunities that we have in the world. Evolutionarily, none of this makes sense. But once we start to understand that the wiring is off, we're smart enough to internalize that and to plan for how do we build boundaries around things that we can start making smarter decisions. Dopamine is not going away. We've got to be the ones who put the boundaries around the production of dopamine in our brains so that we get this whole thing wrapped back up together. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yeah, that might be the humility part.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really appreciate that answer.
Hi, sometimes in Salt Lake we have bad air quality, and they ask us not to use our wood-burning fireplaces. Isn't that just minuscule compared to a wildfire and a forest fire?
Many answers to that. First of all, I never use the term air quality anymore. Let's just start calling it air pollution, please, because it's the double speak. It's kind of soft pedaling it, but air pollution. Right, one of those we have a choice about, the other one we don't. Fair enough?
Yeah.
Maybe you.
Yeah, well, and there's a question of, we have some opportunities to manage our wildfire smoke as well. If we choose to just, dig our heads in the sand and say, well, maybe a wildfire won't happen this year, the forests keep growing, the climate keeps getting drier, the fires are going to happen. On the other hand, we can choose to do more prescribed burn. And that's been a very contentious thing because people say, well, if we don't have to have a fire today, let's not have one. But that's just what allows these mega fires to build up. So one of the things that I've been talking about, and a lot of these talks I've been giving on wildfire recently, is we can't choose a fireless future. How do we want our fire? How do we want our smoke? The smoke coming off prescribed burns is much, much, much less than a wildfire that's just, burning out of control. So I'd like to see a lot more of the prescribed burns getting into the landscape. That means, on a very practical level, how do we deal with the liability of the people who are making the calls about when to light those fires, how to manage them? There were 2 people, last year or year before, who were put in jail because they had done prescribed burns, they were following everything by the book, the winds kicked up, and it got a little bit out of control, and some structures burned. I think we have to think about those things, about, what are we trading off in terms of security today for potentially much bigger risks tomorrow.
Maybe we need some more education on wildfire prevention. I mean, what happened to Smokey Bear?
For sure.
Where'd he go?
All right. We're going to have one last question here. I'm going to give it to Tim here.
Thank you. Our national parks. Yellowstone, not too far away from here. First national park in the world. 1988, tremendous fire. And we did everything we could to put that fire out. Currently, there's a fire raging on the north rim of the Grand Canyon. What should we do governmentally, culturally, environmentally, with regard to our national parks that we consider treasures, but the fact is they're heavily forested, most of them?
Well, I have a lot to say on that topic, but I'll try to keep it brief. Is that these are national parks, and I think we should be able to observe and enjoy them in whatever form they come. And already we're the idea that this is ruined or that ruined because it burned, and they're supposed to be natural places. That seems oxymoronic to me. But perhaps that's just me. But we need to get more used to living with fire. And if what more of an exemplar than our national parks, ostensibly we're not building homes there, but we need to kind of work with that. The rebound after 1988 is fantastic. Personally, I love seeing those burned areas from 1988. I was working around the park in that year. And it's extraordinary. What a scientific lesson for us all to learn and see on our summer vacations and so on. So it's a good thing. It's too bad that a historic building in the North Rim was burned, but it's in a very fire-prone landscape. So if not this year, it's probably going to be next year or the year after. I don't think there's a lot that needs to be done there. And I would be very cautious of things that need to be done that are just going to benefit commerce in those areas. Those gateway communities have an outsized influence on what happens in a park, and I think that's not only morally but ecologically wrong.
Yeah, I'll agree with everything Paul just said, but I'll just add to that I think we need to make them much bigger. You know, this notion that we can have these little postage stamp parks that we protect, and they're fragmented from the much broader ecosystem that supports them, that's not going to work. It's already not working. And so, you know, there are a lot more areas that we should be protecting, keeping those ecosystems coherent and resilient. That's the only way we get through the continued disturbances that we're going to be expecting to have in the foreseeable future. So, yeah, let's make them bigger.
Well, with that, thank you, Paul. Thank you, Patrick. Let's give them another round. With that, I hope you'll come into Elliott Hall and enjoy coffee, conversation. I think they'll be available for more questions if you have any. And we'll see you next week.